Hello. Today I will talk to you about criminal psychopaths and why psychopaths become criminal and which psychopaths becomes criminal. Although the research on psychopathy has grown exponentially for the past 3 decades, and in media it has been a hot topic for just as long, the boundaries of this disorder is still an unanswered scientific controversy, which makes the subject interesting. When we hear the word psychopath, many of us will think about a certain movie characters like Christian Bale in American Psycho or Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lamb. We think about a cold-blooded and calm notorious killer, and when they commit their murders, usually they do it as some sort of a ritual, which makes it seem more like a twisted hobby than anything else. And even though these kinds of psychopaths does exist, they aren't representative of everyone. Psychopath does share certain behavior, traits, and genetic setups, but they most certainly differ just as much as you and me. Maybe this is the most important aspect, to view them as individuals with different personalities, different genetic setup, and certainly different life experiences, just like you and me. Even though media often presents psychopaths as the ones you need to keep an eye on, or otherwise they may kill you, kill your dog, and feed it to your neighbor's cats, I will try to explain what a psychopath really is in a more scientifically based manner, and I will try to answer what's the difference between a psychopath, a sociopath, and antisocial personality disorder. What are the most common traits among psychopaths? Does every psychopath even know they are one? And most importantly, why is psychopathy one of the most important and discussed psychological constructs in the criminal justice system? Even though psychopaths shouldn't be viewed as one and the same completely, they do differ from the general population and should be considered as a different and, in many cases, dangerous entity. And a famous researcher called Karpman suggested that psychopathy could be divided into 2 different entities. The first one he called primary psychopaths, and it is considered as a consequence of a intrinsic idiopathic deficit or genetically influenced. The other category is called secondary psychopathy, and researchers suggest that indirect factors like trauma or mistreatment during the childhood causes behavioral consequences that are quite similar to primary psychopaths, but the underlying factors differ. In the beginning of this video, I also promised that I would try to distinguish antisocial personality disorder, APD, from psychopathy. And the 2 are similar, but there are some distinctions. APD are usually related to conduct disorders and also includes crime or criminal behavior, which psychopathy doesn't have to do. You don't have to be criminal to be a psychopath. And the diagnosed criteria for APD are much more narrow than psychopathy, which means that you cannot be light APD. Either you are or you're not. And that differs from psychopathy since that is measured more on a dimensional scale. Back to primary psychopaths or criminal psychopaths. Of course, they share more traits than the ones I mentioned in the beginning. And the traits are described in a very famous book called The Mask of Sanity, written by Herbie Clickley back in 1941. And this book describes the behavior patterns as charming, verbally skillful, and very intelligent, but also as manipulative, lying, cheating, disrespectful, and their goals always seem to revolve around gaining profit for themselves, like very egocentric. But what may be the most important trait in psychopathy is neuroticism. And this is a trait where we are all measurable on how neurotic we are. Like if you are, it's the tendency to feel negative emotions. If you're high on neuroticism, you have a higher tendency to be depressed or feeling anxious or stressful. And psychopaths are extremely low on this trait, like extremely low. And that may explain their criminal tendencies. Some describe psychopathy as a hybrid condition, which I think are very interesting to think about it that way. On the outside, you see the superficial charm, poise, and sang-froid, but on the inside, there is this contrasted, affective impoverishment and self-centeredness. Some use the triarchic model to describe it, and this model identifies 3 distinct personality domains, which are boldness, meanness, and disinhibition. Boldness captures social potency, emotional stability, and sensation seeking. Meanness captures low empathic concern for others and Machiavellian interpersonal style. And Machiavellism is also a part of the dark triad, which I mentioned in the beginning. The 3 traits we all have. We are all somewhere on the scale. The general population, but for psychopaths it's much more potent. Disinhibition captures a diminished capacity for controlling impulses and emotion, as well as problems with the delay of gratification. The triarchic model is argued to capture the wide range of phenotypic components, and phenotypes are what are expressed on the outside, what we all see. That is a phenotype, and genotypes is the genetic setup. And what we see is superficial emotional responses, lack of empathy, poor behavioral control, and also a charm, a verbally skillful individual, and intelligent individual. And that's why we don't always know when we meet a psychopath that they are one. I found the description of successful psychopaths and unsuccessful psychopaths kind of interesting, because a successful psychopath is someone who didn't get caught even though they did something criminal, and the unsuccessful psychopaths are described as the one that did something criminal and got caught. And maybe the successful also is the ones we don't see as a psychopath, because they hide their psychopathic tendency well. Or about 1% of us on the general population that are psychopaths. And in prison, this number increases from 15 to 25%. But these numbers aren't accurate. It's just an estimation. That means that there's a lot more psychopaths in prison than there are on the street. So they seem to be prone to that kind of behavior, which we already has figured out by now. But there's one interesting thing also, which I want to mention, is that not all psychopaths know they are a psychopath. A famous case is James Fallon, which is a famous neuroscientist, and he did studies on the brain differences on psychopaths. And while he did this, he also scanned his own brain, and when he did that, he saw that I am a psychopath also. And he calls himself a pro-social psychopath, since he can have a normal life and have a family and work as a scientist and aren't involved in any criminal behavior according to himself. So maybe that is a more correct term on successful psychopaths. I can understand how it's hard to know if you are one, at least according to the levels of feeling, because you don't have anything to compare with. How do you know that your levels are lower? If you like someone and you heard about the concept love, how do you know that the things you feel aren't love, if that is all you have felt all your life? I also promised in the beginning that I will talk about why criminal psychopaths are more violent and harsh, and it's also due to neuroticism, and that is correlated with a lot of other things, which I will try to explain now. They tend to commit the most violent crimes, and the return rates are much more higher than for non-psychopaths. It's almost 40% for the psychopaths and 7% for non-psychopaths. They do suffer from amygdala dysfunction, and amygdala is a part of the brain that regulates emotions. It's emotions like anxiety, disgust, and anger, and it helps us learning what we shouldn't do, because if we feel like anxiety doing something or disgust doing something, we're not returning doing it. But psychopath doesn't seem to learn things like that because they don't seem to feel things like that. When these kinds of experiences are tested on psychopaths, they simply don't avoid the same situation as non-psychopaths. It aligns with the fact of low arousal in the prefrontal cortex. It's also connected with diagnoses like ADHD. It's where you unconsciously seek excitement in your environment to rise your dopamine levels. For example, it's connected to the arousal state. That's why amphetamine medicines works for ADHD, because the dopamine gets up so they get calm, because that is what they seek when they get impulsive. And for psychopaths, they kind of behave the same way, but without the feeling dimension. They just do things. So the combination of low arousal and dysfunction in the amygdala, low neuroticism, that generates behaviors that are dangerous, exploitative, cruel. They seek more thrills, and whoever gets hurt along the way, it seems to just create more arousal because they don't feel regret. Psychopaths aren't capable of feeling guilty. And imagine not being able to feel guilt. You aren't aware of that you should feel guilt because you can't feel guilt. You don't know that you did something wrong if you don't feel guilt. So when someone tells you that you did something wrong and should feel guilty, you probably think that they lie. I will try to wrap this up now by saying that I wanted to do this video because I think it's important to talk about psychopathy in this manner. There are so many complex aspects of psychopathy, like the extreme low levels of neuroticism, the dysfunctional in the amygdala, and the low arousal. And these different aspects makes them prone to criminal behavior and makes them prone to more violence. And in the end, I think it's a philosophical dilemma, like how harsh can you judge them when you can measure the dysfunctions? Of course, they need to be in the same criminal justice system, but I think it's an issue that needs to be, kept in the more scientifically based debates and not only the theaters. Like, you need to talk about it as a real issue because it is a real issue. And I hope you found the video somewhat informative, and maybe you will find some interesting topic to talk about later on. Thank you very much for listening.